Hello, everyone.
Hi again. In the finished mystery, we're on page 118. Still in Revelation 6, specifically under the fifth seal, where it is already said, I saw under the altar of the souls of those who had been slain for the word of God and for the witness they had borne. So this is about martyrs. Let's not forget that as we try to apply it to something. And you, if you're a witness, have to apply it to your time. They cried out with a loud voice, verse 10 says, O sovereign Lord, holy and true, how long before you will judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth? Then they were each given a white robe. Notice they're given the white robe, they don't earn it, and told to rest a little longer until the number of their fellow servants and their brothers should be complete, who were to be killed as they themselves had been. Mm-hmm. So at the text that on both ends of it, the fifth seal talks about martyrdom and how long those martyrs would have to wait. Let's see what you do with that. So we're going to skip over what they do with the first part, the white robes there was given unto everyone, each of a lot of tortured stuff here, but we won't bore you with it.
Doesn't really say too much, and it's a little vague, so it's hard to determine what they're getting at.
But they get to the specifics and their real agenda when they go into, and it was said unto them. Now, when would that happen, and how?
Okay, so that paragraph reads, not actually when it was said unto them, not actually, but by the teachings of the parallel dispensations, which show that as Christ was raised from the dead in AD 33, the sleeping saints would be raised 1845 years later, in the spring of 1878.
And of course, they've completely abandoned all of this today, this parallel idea. So the chronology is, of course, abandoned too, right?
So they say the dates aren't there, but this is what they are.
And then what do they say about the phrase that they should rest yet for a little season?
Greek, chronos, 360 years. So they're interpreting it to mean that. This is the item which which Pastor Russell had in mind in the following footnote. When in the succeeding volume we examine the wonderful visions of the revelator, it will be clearly seen that the time here pointed out by the word henceforth, as marked by events synchronized closely with 1878, as indicated by the prophecies herein noted.
And that's a quote directly from Volume 3 of the Studies in the Scriptures, Thy Kingdom Come. Yeah. So, in other words, Russell kind of quoting himself.
Luther nailed the proclamation on the church door at Wittenberg, October 31, 1517, which was already 1 month into the year, 1518, Jewish reckoning. But it took some time for the news to travel to all parts of Europe. 360 years from the spring of 1518 brings us to the spring of 1878, when we understand that God's promises made to the sleeping saints was fulfilled. They were raised from the dead, and Babylon was cast off.
Based on what?
On my saying so. That just seems to be it. It's just nonsense.
And that latter part was the finished mystery writers themselves talking about how they thought this was all going to be fulfilled. And it still has to do with 1878. And it, as you know from the rest of the book, we've covered part of it already, that has to do with also not only the spring of 1878, but the spring of 1918. Something monumental is going to happen. So you have Babylon cast off in 1878, but it will be destroyed completely in 1918, 40 years later, right?
Now, before you go on, though, this first thing that I said, a little season, they have Greek chronos, 360 years. What does the Greek chronos actually mean? Does anyone say 360 years?
Nobody does. It's, as the ESV says here, they're to rest a little longer. So it's a certain period of time, but not attached to a number. That's for sure. So under the phrase should be fulfilled, when's this all going to be fulfilled? They have this. This is again the writers of the Finished Mysteries talking, but introducing a quote again from an older Watchtower. Should be fulfilled, full, completed in number. And then they quote from the 1898 Watchtower. The gospel age is for the very purpose of calling those who shall participate in the marriage feast. If therefore it be true that we are in the end of this gospel age, it implies that a sufficient number of worthy guests have been found. Or to reverse the proposition, if a sufficient number of worthy guests have now been found, it proves, notice that we are in the close of this age. It was after the wedding had been furnished with a proper number of guests that the king came in and began the inspection of the guests. This we have elsewhere shown marks the date, April 1878. Now, of course, you know, if you're
circular
yeah,
reasoning.
it is.
Too.
And if you're a witness today, what have you done with all of this? Well, you've thrown out the old dates based on parallel dispensations, and you've replaced them with 1918 and 1919.
Yeah.
That's the inspection taking place. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think going back to the time period, again, just arbitrary. Chronos, 360 years. The fact that you could say that so boldly shows that you're completely trusting at this point Charles Taze Russell as your source. And he's the only guy who gets quoted here, since if he's not writing the articles or the books, he is the editor of the Watchtower, so you're quoting the Watchtower.
So that's a very high evaluation of one person.
Yeah.
That you will let him define everything as he wants to, arbitrarily. And he can change his mind too, because he did redate things as he went along.
And of course, this idea of the guests being worthy, well, guests who are invited to a feast aren't necessarily worthy to be invited. It's the graciousness and the grace of the person who is the host that gets them in to the
They're
feast.
invited,
right?
yeah.
So you've completely missed the point of the gospel age. You call it the gospel age here. That was the phrase Charles Taze Russell always used. Gospel age will go up until Christ returns. When will he return? Well, you guessed wrong in 1874 and 1878, 1881, and 1914. But the invisible presence idea was there. So he's inspecting us right now. But I couldn't help but think of what Franz did with Jewish reckoning back around 1975. Remember his reasoning? That, okay, by Jewish reckoning, the creation of Adam and Eve specifically, according to the Jewish, this impressed everybody at the district assemblies, I remember. All this elaborate chronological detail, which when you look back now meant nothing at all, because the whole thing went by, and it wasn't a few months longer. It's now getting on for 50, well, it is 50 years this year, isn't it?
Yeah.
The worthiness of the guests, though, is the part that hits me hard, because in Russell's day, you can at least say this for the man, that his view of the gospel age had a lot more grace in it, because he didn't think Babylon had been cast off, and that's quite a contrast with the modern organization. He thought Babylon was not cast off until 1878, and they're continuing to teach that here, aren't they?
Yeah.
So, what can we say except you've been trusting a man and his successors here who are underlining the value of his ministry.
Yeah.
You've been trusting people who are not worthy of your trust.
Yeah. Just that point that you just made about casting them off. The Pure Worship book now makes out that they were never part of God's favor or plan.
Yeah.
That's so outrageous. You know, you wouldn't have a Bible if it weren't for the Christians preserving it, keeping it, translating it, and yet God had no favor on them. That's what the Pure Worship book says.
But Russell should have been paying more attention to the Bible dictionaries, and the Greek dictionaries in particular. He would not have said that chronos means 360 years. What's our link?
We're going to link to a video I recently did called "Who's Worthy to Partake at the Lord's Table?" Yeah.
Excellent. See you soon.